I'm going to tell more. I'm going to tell more. And I see Wob has really kindly asked for the other part of the Welsh story I did at the Earth Camp, which was a really good idea. But I'm sorry to have to say, we might have to do that another time, because I have a very extra special story that I need to tell you tonight. And I would dare say I need to tell it, because I'm on a promise to Jack Hayter, who also performed at the Earth Camp the other weekend. He told me this story, or the postscript to this story, straight after I got off the stage, and it is just extraordinary. And I said, can I tell it? And he said, I really wish you would, because my mum doesn't know how it connects to another story, the first part of this story, which is really quite a well-known story within folklore storytelling circles. So if you tell it, can you get a video for your mum? And I thought, for his mum. So I thought, yes, I shall tell this story, and then she can hear it being told, and that apparently is going to put a big smile on her face. So, going to have to do that story. But Wob, I've just seen your other reply saying that because you grew up not far from Bracknell as well, it was great to hear the Bracknell story. So I'm very glad I've at least given you something that's meeting your desires for this evening. But without further ado, I want to do the whole sort of, would you like to hear the other story? But I think with the we could put it in the chat, I guess, but the delay is probably not going to work that well. But I'll say it anyway. Would you like to hear the other story? And I'll imagine you saying, yeah, go. Yeah, thanks, guys. Yeah. My two audience here are playing along. So are you sure you want to hear the other story?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely positive you hear the other story.
Yes,
yeah, okay. Well, here's the other story. There was, again, a young farmhand. It's so often a young farmhand because there were so many young farmhands in times past, and they all had their hopes and dreams. This young farmhand, he lived in what's now called it's no longer called the Brecon Beacons National Park. Actually, in South Wales, we are supposed to call it Banau Brecaniog, which is, of course, the Welsh for Brecon Beacons. But that was where he lived. Huge, wide expanse of hills and mountains in South Wales. And there, in the Brecon Beacons, there is a lake. And that lake is called Llyn Fach. And this lake is famous because when this young man was watching over the sheep grazing around the sides of that lake, then he spotted the lake water rippling. He saw the lake water parting, and he saw rising up out of the lake water a beautiful woman with the wisest eyes that he'd ever seen. And his heart leapt in his chest straight away. And it leapt again even harder when he realized that she was looking straight at him. And she had a broad, welcoming smile on her face. And he ran down to the shore of the lake and forgot all about the sheep and sat there with her, sat there on the side of the lake and introduced himself. And she said, I know well who you are. I've been watching you from my world beneath the waters. And I thought it was about time that we got better acquainted. And so he knew that if she lived in the world beneath the waters, then she must be nothing less than a fairy, one of the fair folk, the Tylwyth Teg, who live beneath the waters and the hollow hills and are always there, whether we want them to be or not. But right now, he really was quite happy that she was right there with him. And they spent the whole long day in conversation, getting to know each other very well. And he found, by the end of that day, that his heart now sang with love for this woman. And so he was overjoyed when she came back again the next day, and they spent the whole of the next day in each other's company, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that. But every day, at the end of the day, then she had to return to her world beneath the waters, and he had to go back and sleep on the kitchen floor at the farm. And this wasn't enough. So, he bottled up his courage. He thought long and hard. steeled his nerves, and the next time she sat down with him there on the shores of the lake Llyn of Fach, he asked her if she would marry him. And she said yes, straight away, no doubt about it, except for the fact that she did have to return to her world one more time to ask her father's permission. That night, when the moon had gone down behind the mountains, the young man was waiting at the shores of the lake, and he saw a huge figure emerge from the waters, vast and hairy and severe in its countenance. And this great hairy figure said to him, You are the one who would take my daughter away from her world to walk this mortal world with you. I need to know if you can do right by her. You must first pass a test. And he turned, and then out of the water appeared not just the one beautiful woman, but 3 beautiful women who looked exactly identical. And the fairy father said, You must be able to identify which one of these is the woman that you claim you love. Otherwise, she will never come to live with you. And the young man felt his heart fall in shame and embarrassment. But as he looked at these 3 identical women, he saw that one of them stuck forward her foot, and out from underneath the hem of her dresses he could see that her sandal was bound in a very distinctive, unusual way that he recognized from having sat next to her all those days on the lake shore. And so he looked the fairy father in the eye and he said, That's her, she's the one I love. And the father was outraged, but he said, Very well, she will come to live with you, and she will bring a good dowry, for I will not have my daughter living in any kind of squalor. But know this, should you come to beat her, to slap her, to strike her in any way 3 times, then she must leave. She will leave your world, and she will come back to live in her own world again forever. And the young man didn't think there was any way that he could ever possibly do such a thing, because he loved her so very dearly. So he agreed right away on the spot. And right away his love came and clasped his hands, and they were married the very next day in the church. And she lived with him. And better still, she did bring with her quite an extraordinary dowry. Out from the lake came a bull, a cow, a ram, sheep, pigs, horses, no end of livestock. She brought them all to live upon the farm with him. And these were the most fertile, fecund, healthy-looking things that he had ever imagined. And all of their offspring were just as huge and healthy as they were. And so there was wool aplenty and milk aplenty, butter, all the things that they might want to sell. And people wanted to buy it because they'd never come across produce as good as this. And so the young man and his wife did indeed become quite rich, bought their own farm, settled down, had children. All was going well. Until one day, there was another wedding in town. They were off to the wedding, but it was so difficult to get the 3 boys all rounded up and to remember to bring all the bags you need when you're trying to go anywhere with young children. And so they were running late. And so the man said, Well, why don't we ride? Why don't we ride rather than walk? I'll go and get my gloves. Can you get the horses? And so he ran off to get his gloves from inside, and he came back, and she was still just standing in exactly the same place as she'd been before. And he was so much at the end of his tether and so convinced that she must have just been idling and not thinking about whether there were any other tasks that might have needed doing while he was off having his big ideas, that he took his gloves and he slapped her on the shoulder and said, "Weren't you supposed to be getting the horses?" And she said, "Well, I was, but weren't you supposed to be remembering not to strike me at all?" And he couldn't believe what he'd done. And he begged her forgiveness. And he promised that he'd be really careful from that point on. He was for some time. They got to the wedding. Went okay. Came back home, carried on with their lives. Boys grew bigger. But one day, they were going to a christening. A new baby come into the world. And they'd hurried off there, and the boys were sort of off at the back with their hands in their pockets, playing on their iPhones or something like that. But he realised suddenly that his wife was crying. Not tears of joy, but absolute desolation. So much that she lifted back her head and she wailed, and all of the swanky, well-to-do people that they now kept company with turned and looked at her in shock and in embarrassment. He was so humiliated, and he said to her, "Well, I've got wife, why are you crying?" He slapped her across the shoulder. And she said to him, "Well, I was crying to know that this new life brought into this world, this child now, its troubles are only beginning. And yours are deepening, husband, because that is 2 strikes you have given me now." And he realised what he'd done, and he begged her forgiveness. She gave him a chance. They carried on as before. Until sometime later, they were due to attend a funeral at the church. And all of the great and the good, the well-to-do, were standing around looking as solemn as was necessary at a funeral. And he looked and he realised that his wife was smiling and that she was shaking, and then she threw back her head and she laughed in utter joy, and he was mortified, and once more he just completely lost it, and he slapped her upon the shoulder and he said, wife, why are you laughing at a time like this?" And she said, "I am laughing because this poor soul's troubles are now over, but yours, my husband, they have come home to roost." And he realised what he'd done. And he begged her forgiveness, but she didn't even look his way. She just turned and she walked out of the church all the way to their farm. And he followed her all the way, and his 3 boys did too. But she just walked to all the animals' sheds, and she called out to the bulls and the cows and the rams and the sheep and the pigs and the horses and all of the offspring that they had brought into the world while they'd been there. And every single one of them followed her back to Llyn Fach and down beneath the waters of the lake. And the man was without his love, and he was penniless, and he knew which of those 2 things was the greatest loss. And he was alone for all the rest of his days. And that would be the sad and tragic end to that story. But the old texts where it's collected, they add a bit of a postscript to it. They tell us that that was not the very last time that she was seen in the mortal world, because when their 3 sons were grown, then they were travelling through the Brecon Beacons, through Banai Brycheiniog, when they were met at a fence post on their way through a gate by a tall, mysterious woman who they knew to be their mother, come back from beneath the waters and the hollow hills. And she said to them, "I have returned to give you, my sons, a gift, so that you will see yourselves to a good life ahead of you." She gave them the gift of healing. She gave them knowledge of herbs and remedies and the workings of body and mind and soul, so that they could become the most celebrated physicians of their day. And it is said that this is exactly what they did. And the Myddfai, the physicians of Myddfai, were indeed a family of celebrated doctors all the way through sort of early modern times, from I think the 1600s, maybe even earlier, up to very recently. In fact, as Jack Hayter came and talked to me about after I'd done my gig at the Earth Camp, he said this family were one of the predecessors of the Royal Society of Physicians. It's that big, that important. So there was some good that came out of the tale. And that is where the tale normally ends. But what Jack came to tell me was that, and Jack, I can see you're here on the call and you're excited about this, so I'm going to try and do your bit justice as well. Basically, Jack comes right up to me after I've done my set and says very nice things, kind things about it, but then says that his gran always told him that he was descended from one of the Myddfai, the physicians of Myddfai, which means that Jack Hayter is descended from a fairy, which means that Jack Hayter has the blood of magical immortals in his veins, people from beneath the waters and the hollow hills. But as a child, as you might often do, grandmothers often have, my grandmother certainly had all sorts of stories about how we ought to have been richer and more famous if only people had done right by us. And so, understandably, Jack didn't place much credence in this until, he tells me, he was about 16 years old when his grandmother said, because of course, we've got the book. And he said, what? And she showed him that just on her shelves, in her ordinary house, in among all the paperbacks and things, was a manuscript, hundreds of years old, that contained all of the handwritten remedies of the physicians of Myddfai. Early modern remedies. I wouldn't go trying them out yourself now, but there it was. And there were only ever 3 copies of this book in existence. And the others were probably in like National Library of Wales or something, or museums and things. But there was one there in Jack's grandmother's house. And so maybe it's true. Maybe he is descended from the physicians of Myddfai. Certainly the book was there. But the thing was, when Jack's grandmother passed, the book was kept in the family, went to Jack's aunt. But then some rogue from some far distant branch of the family, some sweet-talking scoundrel appeared on the scene, and he promised all sorts of things. I think Jackie said that he'd do portraits of people or something like that and charged all sorts of money. And he also said he wanted to borrow the book for some academic purpose, or getting it properly conserved or something. And he didn't give it back. And he vanished. He did a runner with family money and the family treasure, the thing of greater value perhaps, that book that tied them to the tale of the physicians of Myddfai. Gone. And because he vanished, the book has vanished too, but there were only ever 3 copies in existence. So maybe out there, in some plutocratic billionaire's collection, or maybe in an archive in some far-flung part of the world, or maybe in a charity shop, just waiting for you to stroll by and find it. Maybe the book is there. And so maybe the story gets to carry on. And there, I shall leave you with that ending, and I have burbled on for a very long time, and so it is perfectly appropriate to pass back to Paul and Bethan. But before I do, I shall say thank you, Jack, for such an incredible end to a wonderful story. And thank you for giving me permission to share it. And we will see if we can get this segment of the video onto a link which I will send to you, and you can show it to your mum. And I really hope that she really enjoys it. Take care of yourselves. Have a great rest of the day. Bye.